Hello friends. In the late 90s, if you were into fighting games, then chances were high it was all about that sweet, sweet third dimension. Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter both had spectacular starts to the decade, but would finish it out floundering for relevance. By 1999 in the United States, it was all about Tekken, Virtua Fighter, Soul Calibur, and maybe Dead or Alive. 3D fighting games had completely supplanted the traditional 2D fighting game and were largely the spotlight of mainstream interest. There were still pockets where dingy arcade machines ran hot to see who was the best at Street Fighter III Third Strike, but the real land of milk and honey was the home console market. Arcades weren't dead yet, but boy were they close. The end of the millennium would be a watershed moment for so many arcades, and tragically that would mean the closure of their doors. Virtua Fighter 2 had managed to sell a respectable 2 million units on the Sega Saturn and in arcades. Tekken would become the first PlayStation fighting game to sell 1 million units, then break its own record by selling 5 million copies of Tekken 2, before just Electric Wind godfisting into video gaming legend status with Tekken 3 moving over 8 million copies worldwide and becoming the 5th best-selling PlayStation game ever, making it by default the most successful console fighting game of the generation by a significant margin. This accomplishment wouldn't be topped by the series until the godlike Tekken 7 managed to move a dazzling 10 million units 15 years later. Tekken was simply a force to be reckoned with on the original PlayStation. If you had the gray rectangle, then chances were you owned one or more versions of the King of Iron Fist tournaments and enjoyed them immensely. Virtua Fighter 3, by contrast, would be Sega's arcade darling, and where Namco and Tekken had gone for the mass market appeal with the PlayStation, Sega went for the cutting-edge arcade hardware approach. It's hard to explain how fancy and pricey this tech was for the time. When Virtua Fighter 3 came out in 1996, a cabinet would have cost roughly $10,000 in 1996 money. And if I use the inflation calculator correctly, that would be almost $20,000 today. Virtua Fighter 3 was a gorilla of a machine and the first game to use Sega's then bleeding-edge Model 3 technology. Frankly, nothing else of the day looked remotely as good as Model 3 games, most of which still look damn impressive to this very day. The board was developed with the assistance of Lockheed Martin, and when it was unveiled in 1996, was considered the most powerful arcade board in existence. Like its predecessors, Virtua Fighter 3 was a major hit in arcades, selling roughly 30,000 arcade cabinets worldwide. In Japan, it was the 4th highest grossing arcade game of 1996, and the overall highest grossing arcade game of 1997. So while it seems like Virtua Fighter 3 is outclassed by Tekken due to Tekken's console success, it really isn't. Virtua Fighter 3 was just far more successful in Japan, where the insane asking price seemed moderately more reasonable. Finding a Virtua Fighter 3 arcade machine in 1996 in North America or Europe was essentially a pipe dream. I wouldn't see one in the wild until sometime in 1999. Even then, it still looked very impressive, and 3 years after its release, people were still playing it in the arcades. In most ways, the late 90s represents the last gasp of financial viability for the arcade model in the United States, where in Japan the arcade scene was still very much going strong and would for years to come still. But in the West and Europe it was receding, and many arcades would close up shop in the early 2000s, the PS2 finally tombstoning them out of existence. So, let's take a deep breath and jump back to a simpler time, where you could put in $1 into a fancy machine and get a unique or cutting-edge gaming experience. Presentation. Now this is interesting. Despite coming out a full year earlier, Virtua Fighter 3 looks like it is in a different generation than Tekken 3. Virtua Fighter 3 would see release in summer of 1996 and be followed up in 1997 in the arcade with an update in the form of Virtua Fighter 3 Team Battle, or just TB. Despite many Saturn fanboys whining in daydreams at the time, there was no realistic way Virtua Fighter 3 was going to come to the Saturn in 1996 or 1997. Just wasn't powerful enough. I personally would have loved to see that shit show, but Sega graced us with the phenomenal Fighters Mega Mix instead that year. Virtua Fighter 3 TB would see an essentially arcade-perfect rendition being launched alongside the Dreamcast at the end of 1998 in Japan. It would see release in the US and Europe in the following fall in 1999 with the launch of the Dreamcast. Tekken 3 would be released in arcades in 1997, still running on the same hardware that had run the previous two installments of the game, the Namco System 11 board that was based on the PlayStation prototype and was thus extremely similar in terms of power to Sony's Gray Little powerhouse. The game would be released on the PlayStation in 1998 to the prior mentioned phenomenal success. Despite coming out a year earlier, Virtua Fighter 3 looked like nothing else on the market in 1996. Only Sega's sister Model 3 games would really top it visually in the same era from a pure polygon pushing perspective. The Model 3 was a beast of a machine and comparable in power to the later released and much more affordable Naomi-based architecture that would be released in 1998 and power the Dreamcast. I'm sure if you got to play Virtua Fighter 3 in arcades in 1996, it would have been revolutionary looking. Hell, it looked extremely impressive in the gaming magazines of the time. A true next-generation 3D fighting game like Virtua Fighter 2 and Tekken had come so close, but ultimately failed to deliver. Virtua Fighter would beat Tekken to the third dimension of gameplay by adding an entirely new button, one that would move you in three-dimensional space. Virtua Fighter would not be the first game to implement a sidestep. That honor would go to Battle Arena Toshinden the year prior. It would, however, be the first good game to do it. Tekken 3 was never really a looker in the arcades, but shined on the PlayStation due to the ecosystem just being different. The System 11 was a very respectable board in its time, but the Model 3 was simply in a different league. Namco and Sega had been arcade rivals for many years, and in this battle, the winner was clear. Sega takes the gold this time. Presentation goes to Virtua Fighter 3. With that said, some of the visuals in VF3 have aged pretty badly. Looking at you, Kage, white acrylic pants and mesh shirt combo. There is also something about the art style of Virtua Fighter 3 that screams tech demo to me, even if I can't place my finger on why that is. Tekken 3 has more style than Virtua Fighter 3. The little explosions on each hit are a good example of this, but the graphics just haven't seen a lot of improvement over the first two versions of the game either. The 3D renders at the character select screen certainly saw a huge improvement though. Even still, it just wasn't enough to overcome the obvious technical disparity in these games. Reception. Virtua Fighter 3. GameSpot gave the game an 8.2 out of 10, and IGN would give it an 8.7. Tekken 3, meanwhile, garnered a 9.9 out of 10 from GameSpot, and IGN gave the game a 9.3. Both games scored well on release, but Tekken 3 just scored a little higher. This was the consistent trend among all reviews I looked at. Virtua Fighter 3 was well reviewed, but Tekken 3 was nearly universally loved. I mean, look at that hilarious, almost perfect score from GameSpot. You just couldn't commit to the perfect, I guess. Winner, Tekken 3. Gameplay. I decided the best way to break up gameplay would be by mechanics, single-player content, and the competitive scene for each game to get a more comprehensive view of the gameplay for each title. Mechanics. Starting with Virtua Fighter 3, this game represents a radical departure from the first two games in the series due to the addition of the dodge button, a button that would not return in subsequent releases, instead opting to copy Tekken and just map sidestepping to tapping directions with the arcade stick. But I actually really like the dodge button. It also gives the game a distinctive flavor from Tekken. I also think that the dodge button makes growing accustomed to the 3D space a lot easier for new players than directional tapping is in Tekken. The moment-to-moment combat is incredibly footsie heavy in Virtua Fighter 3. If you are the type of player who loves just moving around your opponent while both snipe at one another, this is absolutely your game. Most matches are spent jockeying back and forth for literal position with your opponent. The 3D terrain really enhances this battle of wills in my opinion, giving interesting twists to both pokes and combos. Combos are still present, and the most evolved this system has been to date, resembling far more what we would come to expect in Virtua Fighter 4 and 5. The viability of combos here are based on the weight of the character being juggled, so different combos must be applied to different characters. Combos still weren't really the focus of the game though. They matter for the explosive damage they represent, but make no mistake, this game is about footsies first and foremost. It actually gives the gameplay a pretty timeless appeal, since the level to entry is pretty low, but the pool is just incredibly deep once you get in. As far as game balance is concerned, from the tier list discussions on forums that I have read, it seems to be agreed that Akira and Kage are in fact the best characters in the game. No real surprise for either there. However, the game is still fairly flat from a tier perspective. Everyone is evidently pretty viable, with Wolf and Jeffrey rounding out the bottom tier, of course. That said, it seems like everyone can win, even the grapplers have their tools, so this seems like one of those games you just pick your main and grind it out. Tekken 3 is the first game that feels like Tekken. The very grounded movement and normals feel so tight and responsive, it's just a dream. The frustration I had been experiencing playing the first two Tekken games for this channel just evaporated as soon as I got into the first round. Tekken 3 plays as smooth as butter. The game isn't as footsie intensive as VF3, but they are absolutely still there. The juggle system is a lot more robust than Virtua Fighter 3 as well, opening up combo opportunities far easier. You look for a launcher, and then whatever string can hit after, maybe an ender, and you have something that resembles a modern Tekken combo. No wall splats or bounds yet, but we are indisputably getting there. The game is also reasonably well balanced. That doesn't mean there aren't well-defined tiers. Jin is your top-tier Mishima boy, and Heihachi isn't a slouch either. Huang and Yasumitsu are also beasts, and Law is just disgusting in this game. Paul, Eddie, Brian, and King, and, the rest all fall in the top to middle, with the Bears and Dr. B rounding out the bottom tier of this game. That said, even the Bears are fun to play and have their own combos. No game is perfectly balanced, and as far as fighters from the era go, I think Tekken 3 is extremely solid. To be honest, I can't really decide which game is mechanically superior. Both are as tight as drums, and I think for their age are both still extremely playable. I don't see one having a clear advantage here, so unfortunately I'm going to be lame and give them a tie in this instance. So it looks like we have our first tie. Single player. This is where the differences open up between the two games. Virtua Fighter 3 was an arcade game, which generally don't have a lot in the way of extra content. Sega in particular was notorious for bare-bones arcade ports, and Virtua Fighter 3 is maybe one of the worst offenders of this. Lacking any meaningful single-player content additions to the hyper-multiplayer-focused arcade game, it feels like a small miracle this game even has a training room, although there is not a move list in the game menu, a choice that by 1998 seems inexcusable for a home release. Even the Team Battle edition feels tacked on and lazy. In Team Battle, you pick 3 characters instead of 1, and the game does its lamest King of Fighters impersonation. The problem is the game has a fairly small roster. With only 13 fighters, the concept of teams often degenerates into having multiple of the same character on both teams. Once I played an arcade match that had 3 pies in the match, 2 on my opponent's team and 1 on mine. This makes the game feel tiny and maybe was an interesting concept on paper, but in execution feels a bit pointless. Tekken 3 also would feature a similar team battle mode, so this isn't even a special feature. To be blunt, Tekken 3 mops the floor with Virtua Fighter 3 from a single player content perspective. The game is absolutely loaded with secrets and unlockables. Namco recognized the bare-bones Tekken 3 arcade game was not going to be enough. The game supports a staggering 21 characters, which is almost early King of Fighters numbers. Sure, some of them are Echo Fighters or Dr. Boskanovich, but still the character select screen represented so much possibility at the time. We would also get Tekken Force, a sublime little beat-em-up you can just play, and is far better than it has any right to be. There was also Tekken Ball, a volleyball minigame you would unlock after you beat the game with every character, another inclusion that was just shockingly fun. Namco brought their absolute A-game with Tekken 3, and in this competition, it is clear who the winner is. Winner, Tekken 3. Competitive scene. Now this is a fascinating aspect of both games. The competitive scene is perhaps the most important thing to a lot of fighting game fans. It is also the most fickle and ephemeral part of these games. Documentation from this period is poor, and footage from tournaments prior to the early 2000s simply doesn't really exist. By the time anyone was taking footage of competitive bouts, both series had moved on, so we aren't really flush with information from the era. From what I can figure out, though, there was a Tekken 3 World Tournament in 1999. The problem is Tekken Tag Tournament would also come out in 1999 and arcades. Then, only 2 years later, we would receive Tekken 4. What I'm trying to say is Tekken 3, despite its fabulous success on the PlayStation, didn't have all that much time to really grow a dedicated competitive scene at home or in the arcade. It is even harder to find information from the 90s on the Virtua Fighter 3 scene. From what I can deduce, the game did absurdly well in Japan, but didn't build much of a scene anywhere else. The game also came out in 1996, and its sequel wouldn't hit arcades for another 5 years in 2001. Virtua Fighter 3 essentially got a lot more time to be the game in the Virtua Fighter community. Because of this, it simply had more time to cement a legacy with the players themselves. To this end, Virtua Fighter 3 seems to still have a weirdly active community on the internet. I didn't jump through the hoops, but apparently, if you're about it, there are programs that let you still play an online game of VF3. This is backed up by the fact that matchmaking Discord for VF3 is routinely one of the most active amongst all the Virtua Fighter games. Granted, today that is likely tens of people, but the dedication still being shown is pretty impressive. Tekken 3 seems to have become a web browser game you can play online if you are so inclined, but I just didn't see much interest online for it. Tekken 3 was extremely well regarded by casual gamers, and it had the chops to be competitive. It just doesn't seem like the community stuck with the game the same way fans of Virtua Fighter 3 stuck with it over the years. So, much to my own surprise, this category goes to Virtua Fighter 3. Winner, Virtua Fighter 3. This is not to say Virtua Fighter has a bigger community than Tekken. It doesn't, and in the US never did. But Tekken as a franchise is extremely iterative. It doesn't tend to have the radical gameplay differences between versions that, say, Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat often do. Meaning there is far less reason to go back to old versions of the game. Tekken 7 is essentially Tekken perfection, so if you have an itch to show who the King of Iron Fist is, then you can just play that game. Virtua Fighter is a dead franchise for all intents and purposes. VF3 also plays distinctly differently from Virtua Fighter 4 and 5. So because of this, I think Virtua Fighter 3 has held on to a very dedicated and loyal fan base that still play it competitively to this day. Tekken 3 might have more people who are nostalgic over it, but VF3 seems to still have players hungry for the next battle. So, winner, VF3. Nostalgia and personal bias. By the time May 1998 would come around, I would be a ravenous Tekken fanatic. I had gotten the first two for cheap, used, in bad shape from a shady GameStop sometime in 1997, and they were in regular rotation along with Marvel Superheroes and Ultra MK3 for my PlayStation. So when Tekken 3 came out, I was more than ready. What I would come to discover was that playing a fighting game in actual 3D space was remarkably difficult. More than one friend just played the game like it was Tekken 2 and didn't bother sidestepping. But over time, I would play relentlessly, unlocking every character, beating Tekken Force, and unlocking the simple and addictive volleyball minigame. I would become completely obsessed with the game, and in my mind, Paul and Yoshimitsu were on equal footing with Crash and Spyro. To this day, playing the game unlocks just a blast of nostalgia that is frankly hard to top. When I think of late 90s fighting games, simply put, I think of Tekken 3. Confession time, I wouldn't get to play Virtua Fighter 3 until 1999, when I got to put some time into it into an arcade in Toronto. R.I.P. Young Street Arcade. Miss you. Third Strike was the game for me at that time. I had gotten to play it at Kahunaville, a 90s theme restaurant, and was completely hooked. Third Strike was the reason I talked my parents into going to this arcade, because I knew they had to have one. They did. I played Q, and I got absolutely wrecked. I was clearly boring the middle-aged Asian man who wanted tougher competition, so after losing several matches in a row, I relented and explored deeper into the arcade. There, I found some older games, including a gigantic cabinet for Virtua Fighter 3. All of my memories of seeing it in magazines were unlocked, and I got hype as hell at the prospect of finally getting to play the game after 3 years of pining. My local arcades only had the original Virtua Fighter. I hadn't even played the second game, or seen it in person for that matter. I didn't love the original back in the day either, as it was literally next to a Tekken 2 machine, a battle it lost at the time pretty handily. But Virtua Fighter 3 looked unlike anything else around at the time. Looking at it now, it's the 3D landscapes you play on. The ground being actually 3D gives the game an element of depth and dimension that it would actually abandon with the 4th and 5th entries, going for a more traditional flat plane in a box or ring instead. Even playing it after Tekken 3, Virtua Fighter 3 still wowed me back in '99. I remember thinking the subway stage and the leaves in the temple stage were just particularly unlike anything I had seen in Tekken or any fighting game at the time. The ring made the game feel alive in a completely different way than Tekken. However, the game was hard as hell and ate my quarters very quickly. Like I said, I was a total noob, but I had a blast before I went deeper into the arcade to play some Samurai Showdown 2. Ironically, they also had a Tekken 3 cabinet, which I never played much of, as it was so close to the console version, but lacked characters, so I never bothered with that version of the game much. But even still, I would go back home and play Tekken 3 religiously with my friends. There was no disputing it. Tekken 3 was the fighting game back in the late 90s. For my friend group, it had gone from Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 to Tekken 3, and it would never go back. But I would still remember Virtua Fighter 3, and it would be tucked away in the back of my mind as a special gem. Flash forward to 2001, the Dreamcast is dead, but still readily available in game stores and Toys R Us. I begged my parents for one, but not for Virtua Fighter, for Soul Calibur instead. I would even go on to get Virtua Fighter 3 extremely early in the life of my Dreamcast collecting, getting it from GameStop for a whopping $13. But to be honest, I think the moment had just passed on the game. It just paled in comparison to Soul Calibur in literally every way. It was the other fighting game I had that wasn't Soul Calibur or Street Fighter. It would get pulled out every once in a while, but just never sink its hooks into me. But it was also 5 years after the game came out, to be fair. Virtua Fighter 4 was in magazines by this point and looked beyond incredible. By comparison, Virtua Fighter 3 seemed just dated. I think Virtua Fighter 3 on the Dreamcast just had an uphill battle because it was coming out against Soul Calibur. An untouched port of the then 2-year-old game was never going to be that exciting. But when you compared it to the insane amount of content in Soul Calibur, it started to just become a little embarrassing. This has led Virtua Fighter 3 to not even being particularly well regarded among Dreamcast enthusiasts. I've seen a number of retro critics just tear into the game, and while I think that's unfair, I think given the competition it had in Soul Calibur and even the PlayStation's Tekken 3, the game just seemed like a bad value. It's pretty crazy how in the span of a couple years a game can go from bleeding edge to a bad value, but that is really what happened here. And I think that is a big reason why, even with this arcade perfect port to the Dreamcast, the game just never connected in the West. But that aside, for me, the nostalgia winner is clear as day. Tekken 3 blows away Virtua Fighter 3 with a Phoenix Smasher. Winner, Tekken 3. Overall winner. Well, friends, this was a whole hell of a lot closer than I ever imagined it would be when I set out to do this. To be honest, I assumed Tekken 3 would blow Virtua Fighter 3 cleanly out of the ring. But let's look at who won what. Mechanics were a tie. Presentation and competitive scene went to Virtua Fighter 3. Reception, single-player content, and my own personal bias went to Tekken 3. If you take out nostalgia, I think honestly these games probably tie, but that's not fun, and nostalgia is a huge reason why we even go back to these 30-year-old games. So removing that from the equation just feels wrong. When you add in nostalgia, Tekken 3 just simply had to win this for me, but I could just as easily see the results going to Virtua Fighter 3 if you had that arcade machine near you. Both are incredible games and absolutely the pinnacle of 3D fighting games from the late 90s. If you haven't played either of these, treat yourself to a nice emulator and play a piece of history. Unfortunately, there are no readily available legal modern ways to play either game. Tekken 2 is bizarrely available for the PS4, but not the third game, and the only modern available Virtua Fighter is 5, but both games are readily available online with a little bit of work, and you can even play against other people online. I hope you enjoyed this topic. I did. And if you did, I'll keep doing these matchups. If there is different retro gaming content you'd like to see, just post it in the comments below, and I will happily look into it. Take it easy, friends. Retro Remy out.